Okay. All right, so everybody, thank you for joining me this evening on this very wet Thursday. My name is Carol Stringer. I am the agriculture agent in North Fulton County, so my offices are located in Sandy Springs. Tonight we're going to be talking about fall vegetable gardening. So I hope you guys are all, I'm assuming everyone here is enthusiastic about gardening and probably likes to cook, because I also love cooking and growing things to make meals from. So if you're somebody that's been doing that all summer, and I would suspect most of you have at least a little bit, because with coronavirus, everyone has been very interested in vegetable gardening this year. So I thought this would be a good presentation to put out there, because this is a good way to extend your growing season and just get a bit more information about just retooling your garden and getting out there. So here's my learning objectives for the evening. We're going to talk about the advantages of cool season gardening. And I will say just briefly that a lot of the things that I mentioned here also apply to the spring as well. So many of these crops you can also plant in the early spring. I'm going to discuss preparing your garden for fall planting, cold tolerance of plants and frost protection methods, planting methods for the fall, and ideas of what to grow based on an in-depth selection of crops that I just kind of picked, and you guys will get the idea. Okay, so why would you grow vegetables in the fall? So first of all, it's good to extend the growing season of your summer garden. So if you've had tomatoes and peppers and now they're kind of starting to look really sad, this is, getting some new stuff in there, getting some exciting greens or broccoli, cauliflower, other things like that, that will give you some other crops much later in the year. Cool temperatures are also really good for many of these crops because they are the ideal growing conditions. Here in Georgia, we have very hot summers, and that's not really perfect for many of our traditional garden plants. And many of these same vegetables produce their best flavor during the cool temperatures, especially things in the cabbage family. Collards are one that's known for that. Some of these crops do not do well at all in the summer. They tend to bolt or become very bitter. And so this is really just their peak time of the year to be grown. There's also fewer pest problems in the fall because your insects are kind of going into dormancy. The weeds have pretty much already germinated and grown. So there's no pests, but there are less pests than certain times of the year. So if you started a garden back in the spring and you've grown a lot of stuff this year, now is the time to clean it completely out and remove any debris, any weeds, old summer plants such as your peppers, anything like that that's just old now, to make room for those cool weather crops. So you're also you've cleaned all that area out. You're gonna want to till the rows to plant for your new plants and seeds. You might have a soil test on if you haven't done one already this year. Based on those results, you might incorporate lime or fertilizer, compost, any of those. And if you have a super large garden and you want to, be just very type A about everything, you can make a garden plan. And now I'm going to go in depth about some of these steps here. So if you've never done a soil test, it is a service that we offer through our offices to evaluate your soil's nutrient content. Now, of course, with coronavirus here in Fulton County, we are still closed to the public. However, you can mail in your sample, and I've got this link here that I can re-provide to everyone through the chat at the end of the presentation again. And that just lets you order a testing kit that'll come directly to your house. But the main thing with the soil test is that you take one that really represents your entire garden. So you're going to want to go through your area in a zigzag fashion with a trowel and just get a small scoop of soil, put it into a bucket, mix that up and allow it to dry. And then you can either go to a neighboring county to drop it off, or you can do the mail-in. And after a week or two, you will get back a detailed PDF report that tells you all about your soil's nutrients and what you need to do and things of that nature. So once you get the results, if you decide to soil test, that is, you need to till any areas of your garden that are bare now that you've cleared them from summer crops. This is a good time to incorporate fertilizer, compost, or lime. So if you have a compost pile or you've purchased compost, anything like that, you can spread it over the top of your soil and incorporate it with a tiller or a small, like a rototiller. Or I used to have this thing called a weasel claw, which is just like a hand turner, and you can just go out there and, however large your garden is. Lime is good if you have your soil test results come back saying that your soil is very acidic. Lime is a really good thing that you can put down to help raise the soil's pH. So if you have soil that is below 6 in pH, you might want to consider adding a bit of lime this time of year. And that's something that I would give you a specific recommendation based on what came back in your soil test. But it does take a very long time to absorb and incorporate. So that's something in the fall is a good time because you're not going to really see those results until the next year. And then if you, base it on your results, again, if you want to add a little bit of fertilizer, sometimes you'll see in their recommendations, you can do a split application, which just means you put half down in the spring and half down in the fall. So whatever it came back, I would probably half the amount for the fall, but just because there's a reduced growing season. And typically smaller plants, things like that. You're not growing corn, this time of year. So if you want to put a small amount of fertilizer out, this is okay as well. And if you didn't do a soil test, but you still want to do a little bit of fertilizer, something that's low content like 10-10-10 is acceptable. I would do it at half or a third of the rate that you do in the summer. So frost protection is important. I've got this in here more as a disclaimer than anything else. Here in Georgia, I moved here from Kentucky, and we have, here it's not anything like what it is in the Midwest. So you're not going to get the super cold temperatures that really require a lot of these things, but I'm going to go ahead and cover them anyway, just in case you put out tender vegetables and you have a really cold snap. It's good to have something that you can put over those plants to kind of protect them, especially if Sunday night we're gonna have a really deep frost. It's gonna be 25 degrees. We better get out there and you make sure they're good. So even after that first frost here, there's a very long, pleasant temperature season here in the fall, which is great for a lot of these vegetables. So if you just watch your weather, if there is a night that comes out, you can cover them with, an old sheet, burlap. One thing that I have listed on here is to make your own row covers. And if you guys know what row covers are, they're like a little hoop that goes over your row of plants. You can make them with PVC pipe or a hula hoop cut in half. And then stretching thin fabric over them, like tulle, like several layers of tulle. If you guys know, that's like the netting stuff that is in like a tutu. Or a thin cloth, or you can buy actual frost protection cloth if you wanted to, and you would sort of just cover those, make like a little tunnel and secure it with stakes. So that's something I might mention again later in the presentation as a way to protect against certain insects or other pests as well. But just be aware that some plants are more tender than others, and that these are some methods you can investigate. So again, just following up with the cold tolerance, some of our plants are very tolerant of cold temperatures, and some of them are a little more sensitive. But I really would consider everything on here to be appropriate for Georgia winter. Any of these hardcore leafy greens, collard greens, kale, cabbages, I really consider all those to be pretty much indestructible when it comes to temperature. When I was living in Kentucky, I used to grow some kale on the side of the house, and there was one year I was like, that thing is never going to die. It was just out there just happy, and it didn't die until it got snowed on. So a lot of these, especially in the cabbage family, are just very strong, very cold tolerant, and probably a little bit more resilient than you would imagine. So there actually are two plantings that you can do in the fall. And I have this information in here just for your all's benefit and information, just so you guys know about this. You can actually get a secondary planting of summer crops around July and early August and get a secondary harvest a few weeks later. So I do include that here just so you guys know about it. I'm not going to go in depth on it. One, because we've already missed the time to plant these crops. Two, most of us know about these or have grown them over the summer already. Three, I've covered them in a separate PowerPoint. So if you are curious about these, there's another PowerPoint on our YouTube page that goes in depth on just vegetable gardening. And my final reason is just that if you plant them, you might get a second harvest, but it's going to be reduced in quality just because the temperature has declined. It's typically wetter in the fall. So it's just, or not actually fall is typically dry, but as it gets more into like the winter, true winter, November and into December, you're just getting a lot more moisture on the ground and rainfall and things like that. And so you just have reduced quality of these summer crops. So I just have this there for your information. Maybe next year you might want to experiment with that. But this presentation today, I'm going to focus entirely on the September planted crops and all the stuff that I really consider a true cool weather plant. So there's two methods of planting I'm going to go over today. And these are every plant that every type of vegetable I'm going to talk about today is either one of these two. So direct seeding is when you are planting seeds from a seed, but you're purchasing seed packets and you're putting the individual seeds out there and you're watching them sprout and making sure that they're doing good. So with that, you're going to go out into your garden. You've already tilled it. You've removed any debris. You got it all ready for this, and you make a shallow furrow, which is just like a little trench. And depending on what seeds you have, you're going to sprinkle them in that little furrow and then lightly cover with a little blanket of soil. Now you can go ahead and give them a little bit of water at this time too, and just kind of maintain them. So I also mentioned here that you want them a little bit lower, although not much lower this time of year, just because of the less soil moisture. So, and I have a seed packet here for you guys to look at. This is just one that I've had here at the house of carrots. And if you guys can see my mouse, let's see here. So you've got days of germination. That just means how long it's going to be before you start seeing the little seedlings emerge. You've got the depth. This is how deep those seeds need to be in the soil. So 1/2 inch is not very deep, and 1/4 inch is very shallow. That's basically just sprinkling dirt on top. Okay, so a lot of these plants that we're going to talk about today that are direct seeded have very, very tiny seeds, and they need to be not buried 3 inches down into the soil because they won't come up because they're buried too deeply. So just keep that in mind. Always look at your seed packets. They're going to give you a lot of good information about what that plant needs. So after, if you don't want to grow stuff from seed this year and you want to get transplants, which some plants do better this way, it's good because it gets your garden established faster. It looks, you've got your stuff out there immediately and you're like, hooray, there's my garden. So some plants like this more than others and they're going to do better. But the big thing with this is make sure you dig a big enough hole to accommodate the root ball of that little plant that you purchased maybe at Lowe's or Home Depot. Gently remove it from its container, put it in there, fill in the gaps with any soil. The big thing with transplants is just getting them accommodated to the new growing conditions. So you want to make sure that they have plenty of water for the next week or so. And throughout the next month, just kind of monitor them as they get adjusted to the new garden environment. So these are my final tips here that I want to talk about before I go into in-depth in the crops. So all vegetables like full sun and well-drained fertile soil, okay, just flat out of the bag. Some vegetables will tolerate more shade than others. So, you know, in your garden site, hopefully, I'm sure you guys have learned, if this is the first time you're vegetable gardening this year, the sunny spots are the best. That's the primo locale. And you want to make sure that what you're planting for fall is going to get plenty of sunlight. Now, that being said, stuff that's very green, like in my mind, something that's solid green will tolerate shade. So that's going to be kale, salad greens, cabbage, Swiss chard, any kind of leafy thing that you're going to eat the actual leaves can tolerate some shade. Plants in the cabbage family, I've mentioned them once before, they are really susceptible to insects, especially caterpillars. So just be aware of that. And that little row cover PVC thing that I was mentioning before is a good idea to also use to protect them just from cabbage worms, some other insects just really like to eat any of these plants in the cabbage family. I mentioned this already, small seeds, small seedlings, because a seed is really like a battery. It's got a finite amount of energy for the seedling to get up through the soil. So you want to make sure any kind of small seedling is a small seed is gonna have a weak seedling. So you wanna make sure you give it everything that it possibly needs to survive. So try to keep the weeds down around where you've planted that. And then once they're up above the ground, if it's a root vegetable, make sure that it is thinned appropriately. Because if you don't thin your root vegetables, they will grow crooked or just deformed. They won't grow appropriately. Like you want a beet to be nice and round and firm. It won't do that if it doesn't have enough room. And then finally, gardening is just a giant experiment. I mean, what do any of us even know? We're all just out here trying it out and trying to figure stuff out and, you know, have fun. Try some purple carrot or something. You know, it's all about just seeing what you like. You might find something you really love, and something you thought was going to be great is just crappy and it wasn't as exciting as you wanted it to be. So just try a couple different things every year, a few new things. That's my 2 cents. You can take it or leave it. So now I'm going to go through what I consider to be true cold weather crops more in depth, just a little bit. And I'm going to go through a whole bunch of them here. So carrots, a great tasty one here, and all the root vegetables that we're going to go over. Every root vegetable should always be directly seeded. So you should always buy packets of carrots, packets of turnips. Never buy like a transplant, because they just don't like it. They don't do well and they'll probably die. So the other thing with carrots is your soil needs to be kind of loose and loamy. It doesn't need to be crusty or filled with rocks, because it'll just cause the carrots to be really deformed. And they're very sensitive to this. They won't grow long and straight like you see them in the supermarket if there's rocks in your soil. So carrots are very slow growing, and they have very, very weak seedlings. So the seedlings come up and they need a lot of help. So you got to make sure that there's no weeds, there is nothing to compete with them to get them growing and started. That being said, there's a lot of variety with carrots. So they're not just orange like you get at the store. A lot of these traditional varieties come from Europe or French, especially like the Chantenay and the Nantes Haflong. Danvers is European too. I can't remember if it's English or French, but there's a lot of varieties from Europe. And then there's a bunch of crazy ones too. So they come in reds, they come in purples, yellows, white carrots. So get out there and look around if you're a big carrot person. There's a lot of stuff out there. So radishes, kind of in that same vein, they're going to be directly sown in the soil as well. Unlike carrots though, radishes grow super fast, super fast. They're probably the fastest growing vegetable you can grow. They're great for kids because they can see the results really quickly and they're fun to pull out of the ground. I don't really notice a lot of issues with insects with them. The seedlings they grow very quickly, so you don't have that weakness like you do with the carrots. Again, just make sure that you thin them down enough so that there's enough room for the radishes to form appropriately. So some traditional varieties, Cherry Belle, that's a very common radish that has the red skin, the little red golf balls that you see. French Breakfast is a similar one. But there's a ton of funky radishes out there. If you like radishes, there are hundreds of varieties of radishes. Daikon radishes are used in Korean cuisine. They make them into kimchi. It's a fermented, kind of like a slaw. Easter egg is a purple and pink mixture. And there's many, many, many unusual Asian types that if you're interested, you can look and see the catalogs and find funky radishes out there. But they're definitely a good one. If you've never grown any root vegetable, I would try radishes. So turnips are one of those plants. Some people love them, some people hate them. There's something I didn't really like until I was an adult. But I grow them all the time now with a lot of success. They don't have a lot of pest problems. Typically, and they grow pretty quickly. 50 days is about when you're going to get your harvest. And the good thing is, if you don't like the roots, you can eat the greens. So some people like to eat the cooked greens, and you know, if you like both of those, more power to you. Some people say that a frost gives them a little better flavor. Definitely the cooler weather gives them better flavor. They're not as bitter. But so a traditional one is purple top white globe. That is like the quintessential turnip. I mean, if you've had turnips in your life, you probably ate that one. But there's, again, a lot of Japanese varieties of turnip that are supposedly much better in flavor, milder, just better appearance, better everything. So again, if you like turnips, you like to eat the greens, I definitely think that these other varieties are worth checking out. Okay, beets are another fun one. If you like beets, they are very similar to turnips. They mature in about the same amount of time. They have edible greens. Again, you need to thin the seedlings down to just one every couple of inches so that they have enough space to develop that big round root. I've got a couple of varieties here that are more traditional, and then the golden beets, if you guys like beet flavor, and I do sometimes, the golden beets are incredible. They're really good, and they're a nice sunny yellow color, and they have a great flavor. They really do. But I think all these root vegetables are good. They're good for beginners. They're good for kids because you can go out there and just rip them, yank them out of the ground, and they pop out, and you're like, wow, didn't know that was down there. So these are fun. They grow relatively quickly, except for the carrots, and can be a real fun one. So if you guys like Swiss chard, now I'm going to get more into the greens and cooked greens and salads and stuff. So Swiss chard is actually the same plant as a beet, which is kind of mind-blowing for the first time you think about it. But if you look at them, they're almost the same. They're basically just grown for a big, robust leaf, and they don't make the root. It's kind of crazy. I promise I'm not making that up. So again, they're about ready in 50 days, and you're going to directly sow them or transplant them. Either one is okay with these. When you're harvesting any kind of big green like this, you're going to cut from the outside and work in. So you want to maintain the growing point so they continue to produce more leaves, and just let them go. And they'll make nice big bushy leaves like that, probably until you have either a really, really hard killing frost or a snow. So a traditional Ford-Hook Giant is a white variety of Swiss chard. It's not as popular anymore. Now you see mostly the rainbow ones, the 5-color. And as far as I know, there's no taste difference between them. So lettuces, again, you can also directly sow them in soil or transplant them. Lettuces are a very, very small, minute seed. They look like grains of salt or grains of pepper when you're putting them in the soil. They're very tiny, and they make very, very weak seedlings. So you need to maintain weeds, keep them back because otherwise they're not going to get there. Make sure they have plenty of water. The good thing with lettuces is that they do really well in containers and raised beds. So they're good for small spaces. And you know, it's enough to make a salad, even from like a raised bed or a big pot. So we'll say that head lettuce is not one that I would encourage you all to do. I would do romaine or loose leaf. And I'm not really sure why. I just know that head lettuce doesn't seem to like our climate as well. Let's see. So butter crunch is a good loose leaf lettuce. Romaine does really good here. And then funky ones, there's a lot of funky lettuces. Black seeded Simpson is one. It's got like frilly edges. Mesclun mix is one we're all probably familiar with. The red and kind of like the red and green mixture. If you like salads, I think lettuces are a good one, and you can get a lot in a small area, so they're one to think about for sure. And they'll take a little bit of shade. So if you can get them growing, you're good to go. So dark leafy greens, I've got kind of condensed for you all in one big slide here. I actually really like kale and spinach, things like that. A lot of people don't like them. They kind of have a bitter flavor. But that is supposedly lessened after a hard frost, so that really astringent flavor that they can have is not as pronounced later in the cool weather. So these can be directly sown with pretty minimal effort, and you'll still have an okay result. They can also be transplanted. So I mean, just this past week I bought some kale, I think, and broccoli and different things like that. And I transplanted these. So again, like with the Swiss chard, you're going to harvest the leaves from the outside of the plant. And that way you can continuously have a supply as the plant continues to grow. And like I said before, I think kale is one of the most indestructible vegetables you can grow, especially once you get it, 6 inches or more. It doesn't seem like the cold weather really deters it much, and it's one that's very tolerant of cold weather. So I've got a couple varieties here. Red Russian kale is one you've probably seen at farmers markets or even the store. Has kind of like a purple color to it. Georgia collards, those are like the ultimate. The one, if you ever had collards, they're probably Georgia collards. It's like the only variety that people grow really. There's several funky varieties of kale out there that come in different textures and colors. Definitely try them. I mean, as far as I can tell, there's not much of a difference in flavor, so that's up to you, but more of an aesthetic value than anything. So broccoli and cauliflower. These are both great. I love broccoli and cauliflower. The big difference is that cauliflower needs to be blanched. So the leaves actually have to cover the top of the head in order to get it to become that very brilliant white color. Some people tie the leaves down, like they'll kind of fold them over it whenever you start to see that head forming. Some varieties now they've bred them so that the leaves will actually curl over it and it's self-blanching. I've never tried any of those. I have some cauliflower this year, so we'll see. I have grown broccoli before, and it's great. And it'll come up on a stalk, and once it gets to a certain size, it produces this head, and the head is actually a immature flower. So if you let it go too long, it'll start to get little yellow blooms all over the top of it, and it's still edible even with a little bit of that happening. So that, don't throw it away or anything. But you need to go out with a knife and you'll kind of push these leaves down around the head and slice it off. So a broccoli might actually produce additional florets after the main stalk is cut. So you might get 2 or 3 small ones grow around where you cut that, which is nice. But then after that, you should pull the plants because they probably will not produce a third cutting. So some traditional, there's actually some really unusual types of broccoli and cauliflower out there. It's kind of, don't see them a lot, but they might come in purples or bright greens. Uh, the Romanesco broccoli, I think, is the one that has the funky whorls in the top of the head. So they're very beautiful. I see there's virtually no flavor difference, but it's still nice. It's still interesting, you know, something to look at. So I would definitely would transplant these. I would not try to grow them from seed unless you were putting them in a like a seed tray or something to make your own transplants, just because they make one really strong stalk that comes up and makes the heads. They're not something like lettuce where you want a whole bunch of little plants growing together. And they get fairly large. So all of these here in the cabbage family get relatively big. So Brussels sprouts also kind of a similar growth. You're going to want to transplant them. They get relatively taller. And they are a type of cabbage. All these are technically varieties, cousins, cabbage cousins here. So you're going to want to transplant them. So as they start to form these little knobs on the stalk, you're going to go out there with your knife and cut from the bottom up. You can cut the bottom leaves off as well if it's easier. And then just harvest as many as you want, and then, you know, take those away, cook them for dinner, and then, you know, wait a couple weeks and the plant will keep growing and producing more knobs until it gets to a certain point, you know, and declines. In my experience, Brussels sprouts, and as I mentioned before, Brussels sprouts are very susceptible to insects. You know, we like to eat these plants, so just make sure that if you're having a lot of issues, and if it doesn't bother you, that's great. If it does bother you, you might want to consider covering them or using some sort of insecticide. So I'm only going to talk briefly about kohlrabi because it's one of those ones that's, I'm mostly just showing it for just for fun. It's another cabbage member, and it's, instead of growing for the root or growing for the stalk or growing for the leaves, you're growing it for the stem. So these make like a nice turnipy sort of vegetable. They're actually very pretty, especially these purple ones. They are one that I would probably transplant as well. And they're going to have similar maturity to like a turnip. So I've talked about it multiple times already in the cabbage family, but cabbages themselves, I definitely would transplant them unless I was growing them from seed to make transplants. They take up a lot of room in your garden. So this is not something I would put in a raised bed probably, or a container, unless you just want a container with one giant cabbage in it. As the head itself forms, I really think cabbages are kind of a funky vegetable. You know, we see them all the time, but if you really look at them growing, they're very ugly because they just are like a stick with all these leaves and kind of like making a leaf plate and just a giant bowling ball on top. So they're really funky. So it does take a while for it to make a very firm head like we see for slaw or anything like that. So as the plant gets to a stage where you want to harvest that and you want to take it inside, you know, you can go out there and kind of squeeze on it to see if it's hard. You want it to be firm and large enough. So whenever it gets to this stage, like this cabbage right here, I would go outside with a large kitchen knife and I would push all these exterior leaves down. I would break them off, just push them all the way down. And then you're going to take your knife and you're going to slice at the very bottom of the cabbage to get it off there. And once you've done that, it's done. You need to pull the plants out and throw them away because they will not make a secondary cabbage. It's just a one and done situation. But if you're, you know, you like slaw, you like anything like that, cabbage soup, they are, you know, something that takes up a lot of room, but they're good too. So no hate on the cabbages. My mom and dad love them. I don't love them. Sorry, any cabbage lovers out there, but yeah. And they also, again, have a lot of caterpillar issues. Make sure to cover them. Early Jersey Wakefield, that's like one of the most traditional cabbage varieties. And then I've got some funky ones here too, because like you don't think about it, but bok choy is actually a cabbage too. Cabbage family is big, got a lot of cousins. Napa cabbage is another one. There's actually some really interesting Asian cabbage varieties. So if you do like cabbages and you like to cook Asian foods, definitely worth investigating. Okay, peas. So peas are not in the cabbage family. Peas are in the legume family, which legumes include beans mostly is the big thing. And there, of course, there's a million types of beans, right? There's pole beans, there's shelling beans, there's green beans, there's soybeans. So peas, they definitely need to be directly seeded. So if you think about like a can of peas that you have for dinner, or maybe you ate as a kid and you hated it, each one of those little peas is a seed. So whenever you go out to your garden and you're planting last year's peas, which is kind of cool. So they need a lot of support because they're climbing. As you can see here, they produce these tendrils. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with kudzu. It's also in the legume family, and it makes those climbing little arms. We all love kudzu so much. So a pea is kind of similar. It needs something to grow onto, and if you put it on a trellis, it makes it much easier to harvest. So there's 3 different types. Shell out peas are ones that are just grown for the actual peas themselves, so you throw the pods away. Snap peas are the entire pod and the pea itself are both edible. And then snow peas are grown just for the pods. And most people have had those in like an Asian stir fry, something like that. So they're all kind of similar in terms of flavor, but just depends on what you want to do with them. And so I've got a couple varieties here that are more traditional, but these are relatively cold tolerant and they're kind of different than a lot of the other crops that you're going to grow this time of year, like the cabbages and greens and salads and stuff. So just something different. And then finally, something really different. So garlic is a fun one. If you've ever grown garlic, it is done completely different than everything else you're ever growing. So the first time I ever grew garlic, I was at somebody's house in October and I worked for them. I was kind of like a garden assistant when I was in high school, and they were like, yeah, time to plant the garlic. And I'm like, what? It's, almost Halloween. This is crazy. So it requires vernalization, which means that it requires a period of cold in order to complete its growth cycle. So garlic, if you ever get it at the store and you break it apart for cooking or anything like that, each individual clove is actually not a seed, but it's what you would use to plant. So whenever you're ready to plant your garlic this October or November, you go outside and you make a trench and you have your heads of garlic and you break them apart into individual cloves, and you're going to plant those with the pointy side up in the trench and then cover them. But the thing with them is that they're not like a true winter crop in the sense that you won't harvest them until next summer. So they grow all winter and all spring. And then in June, they start to dry out and you can pull them out and weave them into those garlic ropes if you wish. But honestly, I think they're really cool just because it's crazy that you have something that grows in the coldest part of the year. These were some varieties that were recommended based on our growing conditions here. I've never had either of these particular varieties. There's like a lot of different types of garlic as well, but they're all grown basically the same. Just something that was just a funky thing I threw in here for you guys to try. So that's actually all that I have for you all today. I'm going to escape this really quick, and I'm going to put these links for you all in the chat box. So the first want you guys to look at these. Let's see if I can go to the chat. Okay. So this is a link to our home garden publication series, and that is got all these in much more depth, basically. So if you are interested in the garlic, you could go there and there's like a 2-page quick guide that'll tell you much more in depth, planting depth, types of varieties, which ones do really good for most of these crops, and also for summer crops as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and give you guys this as well. This is a survey. If you guys want, like while we're wrapping up and answering questions here, if you guys have a moment, I would really appreciate it if you guys took a minute or two and did my survey. And then I have one more link I'm gonna give you before I start answering questions, and that was the soil test preparation here. So if any of you are interested in doing a soil test right now, you can go to this website and order a soil testing kit, and that will, it'll basically send you a mailer and send you instructions, and it costs $15, and that includes the postage and everything. And you can take your sample that way and get it that way. You can still get your samples in even though our offices are closed. So now I know that a couple of you are posting your questions in here, so I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to zoom back up and see, let's see, overwintering potatoes. And so I am not a potato expert. I'm just going to be completely honest. I don't know the answer for overwintering potatoes. Typically, in my experience, I would dig them. If you have any that are out there that are left, I would definitely get them out of the soil, because in my experience, I've only grown them in Kentucky. They kind of get gross if you leave them too long. They sort of want to rot and stuff like that. Pepper plants, can you bring them inside during the winter and get an early start? Yes, I have heard of many, many people doing this, especially with the really hot peppers. If any of you are on Reddit or know what that is, I used to follow a group that was just about hot peppers. Plenty of people will bring them in and they will overwinter and be ready for next year. And yes, you can directly sow now, not in this exact moment because it's super wet outside. So wait till it's dried out a little bit, sometime this week. But yeah, anytime now until October is really good. I mean, I think right now is really primo time to start with these vegetables. How deep of a pot would you need for beets? I would say like probably at least 8 to 10 inches, I would think. A standard, like, you know, when you go to Lowe's and you buy like a large terracotta pot, a standard size one would grow them, I think. It wouldn't grow very many of them because it's not super wide, but that would have plenty of depth. I would say 10 inches at least, 8 to 10. Arugula is another one. Yes, I didn't include, you know, I was trying to hit most of the highlights here. Arugula is another one that does really good. That's one I've thought about growing. Certain vegetables do deplete soil nutrients more than others. That is a really good question. Oh, hey, Tara. So yes, so you should probably rotate some of the vegetables around in your plots. Most of the things that we talked about here are not heavy soil feeders. The peas would probably be, they're one that is going to fix nitrogen, so they're going to add nutrients back into the soil. Really, the vegetables that I consider to be heavy feeders would be like broccoli, the cauliflower would be one. The big one in my mind is corn, which, I mean, we're not talking about corn right now, but corn is a horrible, it just sucks everything out of there. Because, I mean, it makes such a huge plant, you know. So think about it like that. Anything that's growing pretty large is going to take up more nutrients. But the peas are a really good one because they actually add nutrients back in. If I'm lazy and don't blanch my cauliflower, will it affect anything other than the color? I don't think so. I actually don't know, but I don't think that it would have any effect other than making it white. So probably that started as something as a marketing thing. Like if you guys are familiar with like other countries, some European countries blanch asparagus, and all they do is they just sit pots on top of it and it turns white, and it's kind of like a delicacy, but it's exactly the same as the green asparagus. So I would say that it might not be as pretty, so it probably started as something to help people make sure that it was, you know, it has a nice appearance for like a market vendor, things like that. Probably the cauliflower will do it a little bit on its own, but it won't just have that super bright white color. So broccoli you can grow from seed. I think it's a tiny bit late to start it from seed this year. I probably would have started it maybe a little bit earlier than this. I have problems with it also getting too hot too fast for broccoli in the spring, so I think this is a better time to try it. You can definitely still try to grow it from seed at this point. This isn't like wildly late or anything. But yeah, it does okay from seed. It's just in the spring, it gets way too hot. Growing peas for the shoots, I don't know. I'm assuming that means a culinary, like perhaps they're using the shoots in some sort of recipe, like maybe stir frying them. I actually don't know that answer, Tim. You need to elaborate for us. I'm assuming that's a culinary thing. So, oh yeah, I'm sorry. Taryn says that eat the shoots. So yes, I don't know about this. So delicate peas, great in salad. Okay. And do not peel the garlic cloves before planting. So you would take like a head of garlic, even one that you got probably at, one that you get at the store might not grow as well. Sometimes they like irradiate things in the grocery store so that it doesn't start sprouting. But I've had plenty of garlic sprouts from just stuff that I bought at Kroger or anything like that. But you would just break the head apart and the cloves, just pop them in the dirt. That's it. So they don't need peeled. And I didn't cover onions or shallots because they're a real pain to grow from seed. I've only grown onions in the spring, and they were the green onions, which are more of like a traditional sort of country vegetable sort of thing. Green onions you grow from a set, which is basically just a bag of baby onions, and you'll put them out there and they'll grow, you know, up until the size that you want them to, and then you pull them out. But if you try to grow onions from seed, they take a really, really long time. And I've never done it successfully. So that's one that I don't have a lot of good information on. We have publications on it where you can look about from our experts and things. It's just not one that I have the patience for, because I want to, you know, by the time they're ready to do something, I want to put another plant out there. So that's just not one that I have grown a lot of. Okay, let's see here. Oh, okay, radishes had beautiful leaves, but no roots. I'm going to say you probably didn't thin them a lot. So you need to thin them so there's just like one plant per 2 or 3 inches, because they need a lot of room to make that little puffy root. So if you don't thin them, they just kind of look sad and they grow really spindly little roots. So try to thin them, be really ruthless, and get those extras out. Lay tool directly over the seeds. Actually, you know, I'm actually gonna stop the recording really quick. Stop recording.